It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative peer and Times columnist Daniel Finkelstein, Labour MP Stella Creasy, the writer and broadcaster Timandra Harkness, and New Statesman political editor Stephen Bush. Today, how long will England's lockdown last?
These measures, above all, will be time limited.
Our assumption, on the basis of everything that we know, is that we will be able to exit these national restrictions on the 2nd of December.
But could it go on for much longer? The Prime Minister will say there's no alternative. Why is compensation for Windrush victims taking so long?
They're using it as strategy, hoping that we will give up. But you've come across a generation who are not ready to give up.
And there's just a day to go until another unpredictable election night.
And we are going to win 4 more years in the White House.
The power to change this country is literally in your hands.
More on that later, but let's start with where we are on a coronavirus vaccine. Experts have estimated that it will take 12 to 18 months to develop a new vaccine at high speed. Now, under normal circumstances, they say most vaccine development programmes take more than 5 years, taking safety into account. But today, the former Labour Prime Minister Tony Blair has said it should be deployed now to treat all coronavirus patients in hospital at serious risk of illness, not just those taking part in a national clinical trial. Let's hear what he said.
My point is, don't just leave this to the normal process, interrogate it, because if you do get to the point where you know that it's at least reasonably effective, there's no point in waiting in order to see whether it's actually 60 or 70% effective, because even if it's 40 or 50% effective, it's definitely worth having.
Tony Blair there. Should the government take his advice, Stephen?
Well, so on the one hand, it's a very persuasive argument because even a moderately effective vaccine does allow you to loosen up some restrictions. However, we know, and this is true of basically all vaccines, that the initial vaccine tends not to be that effective. And I think then if you were to do something like that, you would need to have started already to educate the public about the very real downsides of a very early vaccine. So if you take, say, the efforts to eradicate polio, one of the things which has hindered that was a lack of candour about the relative ineffectiveness of early dropshell treatments in parts of the global south. So I think it would be a mistake at this point to go, hey, here's a vaccine, because people have basically, through a failure of both politics and parts of the media, been led to believe that a vaccine is this magic thing which eliminates something at 90%. And the big thing we have to fight against now is basically anti-vaccination sentiment, and having a relatively untrialled vaccine would only boost that problem, I think.
Timandra, what's your view?
Yeah, I think that is a very real problem, that people remarkably are... I mean, I find it remarkable that they're saying, well, I don't know, I don't want to take an early untested vaccine.
Well, you can understand they might be worried about safety.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think it's very reasonable. But, I mean, epidemiologically, I think he does have a point, and much as it pains me to agree with Tony Blair, but, if you had something that reduced your chance of catching it or becoming seriously ill by half, that would be a great thing. But you are right, it would have to be rolled out on the basis of, look, this is still a trial, we think it might cut your chances by half, please don't change anything else you're doing, but we hope that combined with the other things would actually be enough to get us out of endless lockdowns.
Danny?
It's not effectiveness that worries me, it's safety. Obviously, once you've gone past the point where you can be sure using the vaccine is safe, then Tony Blair's point has got a lot of force to it. But before that point, it doesn't. I'm actually a bit surprised by it. You've got to be sure that, if you're injecting people with something, you know what that is. And that's why we have a system. Of course, we've got to speed the system up, but I don't think you can just say, well, the safety checks don't matter. They do, and we know that. Really quite late in vaccine trials, problems can emerge. So I must say, my position is almost exactly the opposite of Timandra's. I'd quite like to take the advice of Tony Blair, but I don't feel I can.
Right. Stella, would you like to take Tony Blair's advice?
Well, I think what was probably depressing to all of us was within 5 minutes of being on the Today programme, because he didn't just talk about vaccines, he also talked about the therapeutic drugs and the role of testing and basically what you could do in the next 6 months. And he just seemed to have more of a plan than Boris Johnson and his lot have had for the last 7 months. I agree with Danny. The question here is about Senator Tony Blair. I don't think he suggested that we use the vaccine if it was safe. What he said was, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, that if the vaccine was creating a 40 to 50% immunity process, then it was better to start rolling it out than waiting until we got to 60 to 70%. I think we should just listen to the scientists, but I think he's got a point, and it was depressing to hear somebody who'd thought about what we could do in the next 6 months, as opposed to a Prime Minister who kind of seemed to cobble things together on Friday night and that still seem to be unravelling even now.
Well, let's move on because, as we now all know, we are entering a month-long national lockdown in England from Thursday until December the 2nd. Now, the second lockdown is different to the first one that started in March in a number of ways, perhaps the main one being that schools and universities are going to stay open. We heard also from the government, from Michael Gove yesterday, that they haven't ruled out extending the lockdown beyond December the 2nd. So let's have a look at how the papers, or some of them, are covering that. We have the Daily Mail. The headline is "A Nightmare Without End." This is obviously focusing on fears that the lockdown could continue beyond December the 2nd. And then, obviously, the Mirror has a slightly different headline, but along similar lines: "Lockdown Xmas Fear." Let's talk to Home Office Minister Victoria Atkins on this and various other things. Victoria, thank you for joining us. Is this lockdown a month long, or could it go on?
Well, what's really key is that we do, as the Prime Minister will set out today in his statement, but that he also talked about on Saturday, that we play our part in following the rules of this lockdown, because the advice that we've received is that if we do this now, then we very much have the hope and the expectation that in early December, on the 2nd of December, that we will be able to re-enter tiered regional systems.
It's a hope and expectation, so it could go beyond December the 2nd.
Well, we have got to be realistic. We've got to play our part and ensure that we're staying at home unless we meet one of the exceptions that the Prime Minister has set out.
Yes.
This is the basis. We've been clearly working on these statistics, listening to the data and reviewing it very carefully over the weeks and months that have passed. And we have tried the regional system, and now, given the data that the Prime Minister and other senior cabinet ministers saw on Friday, yes, they have taken this extraordinary step.
Right, but realistically, and just to be clear, it could go on, it could extend beyond December the 2nd. You don't know how long it'll last.
No, in fairness, what we're saying is that if everyone plays their part, then the advice we've received is that we will be able to step away from the national lockdown. This is why we don't want to reintroduce another national lockdown.
I understand that.
Why we tried the regional systems.
All right.
But now we're at a stage where we have to take this step. And if we all play our part, then the advice we've received is that we will be able to re-enter local, regional systems in early December.
But Victoria, you said that you've been listening to the scientists, you've been taking on board the statistics, but your scientific advisor, Sage, called for a short lockdown 6 weeks ago. Why weren't you listening then?
Well, of course we were listening, but the Prime Minister has an extraordinarily fine balancing act. Not only must he consider the impact of the virus itself, he has also got to balance the impact of a national lockdown on the economy. He's got to think about the well-being of us all. There's already been mention of the huge impacts that this can have for people staying at home, and of course wanting to keep schools and universities and so on open. So we have tried at every stage to act, the right time, taking the right measures, but we have now reached the point where this very chilling statistic that if we don't act now with these restrictions, that we are looking at exceeding surge capacity in the NHS by the 4th of December. That is a chilling statistic which we have to act on.
Right, you say the right decision at the right time. We've heard the government repeat that phrase, but Professor Andrew Hayward, who's a government advisor, said this morning that thousands of lives were lost because of your 6-week delay. Do you accept that?
Well, there are a range of scientists, a range of opinions. The data that the government considers is that is collated and formed by SAGE, teams of scientists advising government.
And they called for a lockdown on the 21st of September.
But as I say, the Prime Minister has to consider not just the impacts of the virus, but also the impacts on the wider NHS, people who don't have the virus but who need to seek medical help for other conditions, and of course the impact on the economy and on our national well-being. This is an incredibly finely balanced judgment, and we've tried the regional approach, but because the infection rates have increased as they have, we're now at the stage where our advice is that if we don't act now with this national approach, then we will have that very, very concerning scenario with surge capacity in a month's time.
Now, you've modelled the health impact of this lockdown and the lives that could be saved. Why haven't you modelled the economic cost?
Well, the Treasury, the Chancellor, of course, will be modelling, and indeed, you know, when we look at the schemes that the Chancellor has introduced over the last month that we have been suffering with this virus, you will see the impact that the furlough scheme has had, for example, protecting 9.5 million jobs over that period of time. You will see the plans that have been made for the job support scheme, and of course then the very, very quick response of the Treasury to the decision over the weekend in relation to the health data to extend the furlough scheme beyond yesterday's initial deadline.
Right, but that's one of the concerns that a group of Tory MPs have. I mean, Sir Graham Brady, the chairman of the 1922 Committee of Conservative Backbenchers, has also said that the impact on civil liberties will be even worse than the impact on the economy. He told the Westminster Hour on Radio 4 yesterday, if these kinds of measures were taken in any totalitarian country around the world, we would be denouncing it as a form of evil. What do you say to him?
Well, doesn't it show, as I said, I go back to it shows the very, very fine balancing act that the Prime Minister has had to make.
Right.
And
so you're accepting that it is...
The fact that we have tried our regional Caesar system, that
but he doesn't think it's finely balanced. That's the whole point, Victoria Atkins. Well, Graham Brady says it isn't finely balanced at all. He's comparing the UK government's measures to those that would be taken in a totalitarian country.
Well, you have to speak to Graham about that.
Well, we have.
What I see is the very, very difficult balancing act that the Prime Minister has had to make. And, you know, no one can suggest that Boris Johnson isn't, keenly aware of the impact on our rights, our civil rights, on our ways of conducting our day-to-day lives. I think, you know, that most people would see the concern that the Prime Minister has had in coming to this decision. I underline again, nobody wants us to be in this situation, which is precisely why we've taken this tiered approach. But we now find ourselves in the situation where the Prime Minister and others have been presented with these figures and they have to respond, they have to act.
Victoria Atkins, thank you very much. Timandra, listening to that, and you heard the words of Graham Brady there, is it an unnecessary intrusion into people's lives?
I think it's extraordinarily disproportionate. I was avidly watching all the graphs that were wheeled out during the great solemn announcement, and I couldn't see anything there that justified taking this level of measures.
Even the 4,000 deaths a day if there wasn't any government action?
The 4,000 deaths a day comes from, there was a graph that actually, if you could see it, which actually you couldn't mostly when it was first displayed, there was a graph that had the very scary bell curves, like, oh, you know, here's the last peak, here's these bell curves. It actually said these are not predictions, these are scenarios, they date from early October. The very large one said 4,000 deaths a day. That was if nothing was done. That was they're saying if we did nothing, if we had no restrictions, if nobody took any measures, nobody covered their faces or stayed home or anything, it would be 4,000 deaths a day. So this has got nothing to do with that. The R number is already coming down. If you looked at the current measures, you would say, well, these appear to be working. The R number's coming down, balancing, destroying not just the economy, but the fabric of human society.
Danny?
For that.
Well, I understand the argument, but I don't accept it. I think that we have to act if we are going to follow through a strategy of trying to control the virus. Of course, one possibility is to let the virus rip and to hope that we're going to end up with herd immunity because we don't think we're going to get a vaccination. But we've got to make some sort of calculations about what will happen to the National Health Service. And if the Chief Medical Officer thinks that by the 4th of December we'll reach surge capacity and advises the Prime Minister of that, well, what else can he do?
But this is the thing. This is constantly posed as, oh, well, I suppose you want to just let the virus rip and let everybody die. And that is absolutely not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the measures we take against the virus have to be proportionate and have to take into account the damage they cause to other things. And this is not just a matter of, oh, let's worry about the profits of Pret-a-Manger or something, leaving aside millions of people being unemployed as if that will have no long-term health effects. The effects on people's health and on people's lives now are massive.
You have your own view of that, and I respect that. But as somebody who's not a scientist, I choose to rely on the consensus of SAGE and the Chief Medical Officer's advice rather than yours. And while I respect yours completely, and by the way, you may turn out to be correct. I don't know. But we've got to make some sort of judgment, so does the Prime Minister, on the basis of a consensus scientific view. And this is the view that he is following. I completely understand that you've developed your own view about the development of SAGE, which you've decided to announce on Politics Live. But I'm going to follow the modelling of the Chief Medical Officer, which doesn't seem to be, and the Chief Scientific Advisor, which doesn't seem to be a bad way of proceeding.
Right, Stephen, is there a moral and medical imperative to act, as the government would say now?
Well, look, it's unknowable. I think, given that we know that the NHS comes under pressure anyway in December, we can look across Europe where, because the disease arrived in continental Europe before it arrived here, look at what's happening in France. I think we can make a reasonable guess that actually the health actions the government is taking with reference to the coronavirus are entirely proportionate. And I think it's important to state that because of our independent central bank, actually the economic cost of the lockdown is a choice, not a necessity, right? We can subsidise businesses and households through the pandemic thanks to our central bank, thanks to our control of our currency. What is true, however, is we cannot central bank our way through the mental health and social costs of another lockdown. And that is where the question about whether or not it is proportionate to have a situation where we are going to continue to lock students away from their family homes rather than allowing them to return, for example, that we do not have measures to protect and allow people to, be with their partners when they are giving birth. Those are proportionate questions. But the pressures on the NHS in winter are very clear and are the subject of overwhelming consensus among scientists and medical professionals.
Stella, do you think this lockdown could go on and on?
I don't think we can discount it. And I think that's what's so frustrating I was talking to businesses in my community who are on their knees already and were just incredibly frustrated that they'd spent quite a lot of money making their businesses COVID secure because the government had a proposal to have a circuit breaker and to actually have a second lockdown a couple of weeks ago, only to find on Friday night when they looked at Twitter and what Robert Peston was saying, and this is no critique of Robert Peston, but to find out their businesses were going to be shut. So I can understand why people are incredibly frustrated and pessimistic. And I know we're going to come on to talk about the schools and the universities, and they're also very worried. I mean, taking Stephen's analogy to one stage further, I think the challenge here is you might be able to central bank your way out of unemployment. You might be able to invest, as I think all of us would like to see happen, in mental health services. You can't central bank your way out of thousands and thousands of people dying from a virus for which there is increasing evidence that you can be repeat infected. So even this idea of herd immunity without mass vaccination to drive the virus out and control the virus out of the population isn't a sustainable outcome either. None of us on this panel, I don't think, are scientific experts in epidemiology, but I think we can all recognise if repeatedly the scientists are saying to you, you need to take a circuit break, lock things down now, to not listen to that and then change your mind 2 weeks later is not only morally due, medically dysfunctional as well.
Right, well, Danny, on that point, the Prime Minister has made so much political capital out of sticking to a regional approach of lockdowns. We're going to play you a bit, actually, from Prime Minister's questions, when he said it would be a disaster to have a national circuit breaker in response to Keir Starmer calling for one. Let's have a listen.
With all the psychological, the emotional damage that lockdown of that kind brings, he can't say how many circuit breakers he thinks would be necessary. He can't say how long they would go on. He can't say how much damage they would do to the UK economy and to people's mental health.
Daniel, was it wise to campaign so fiercely against a national circuit breaker when he must have known it was a possibility?
No, but the unwise thing is the campaign bit. We're in the middle of a national crisis and, whereas I think some of what Graham Brady said was a bit foolish, I don't think it's foolish to say we are doing something incredibly serious. We're expecting incredibly serious things. And my view is we have to have both sides of the House working on it together. I hear what Stella, who I've got a lot of respect for, is saying, and she's finding all the political angles where the government has been weak. And, and some of these criticisms I share and some I think are a bit unfair. But the reason is we've tried to proceed with politics as normal, in which those critiques go ahead, rather than accept we're in an abnormal situation. So if the Prime Minister, he's had his comeuppance because, basically he wasn't right, actually, in the end. He wasn't able to sustain his position. But the real problem was trying to enter into a political argument with the leader of the opposition in a situation when we're expecting the whole country to get behind something as serious as a second national lockdown. So I don't approve of the entire idea of finding political angles from either side. I think that we're in the wrong place entirely.
Right. Stella, do you agree with that?
Well, I don't actually think that's fair, Danny, not least because at the weekend, so one of the questions that came up was, and I have a vested interest in this as a new mum myself, whether paid babies and young children were counted in the figures so that if you went outside the house, you could meet with somebody, and which for a lot of new parents, particularly new mums, is absolutely vital to be able to go out and meet with somebody to go for a walk. And actually, the government did listen to the concerns that were raised across the House, and many of us, including myself, said this is good, this is welcome. The point is this is happening on the hoof. I think people in my community are grown-ups. You can present them with information, you can present them with things that you don't know and say, look, there may be a risk, as long as you treat them like grown-ups and you share that information with them. When we're seeing even ministers saying that they didn't know that a second national lockdown was going to be announced, it's the impression of chaos that is so destructive, because then people don't, any of us, that we know what we're trying to do, because we're not.
I just think it's bound to be done on the hoof because we're in the middle of a crisis that is moving very rapidly. So that I don't think that's a fair criticism, but it is a fair criticism to say, look, the scientists did say we should lock down, and I thought this too, that we should take stronger action earlier, and we didn't. And this, what's happened is a consequence of that. But the chaos argument, well, of course it's chaotic because we're in a chaotic position.
All right, we're going to move on to schools. Did you want to say something before?
I think actually, I was just struck by what Stella said about treating people like grown-ups. I think one of the worst things this government has done in its pandemic response is that there was a massive social solidarity in March. And lots of people going, well, we don't particularly want to be locked down, but this is what it takes. We're all going to stick together. Massive levels of people going along with regulations. And that has been absolutely squandered. I think the more arbitrary, ineffective things are introduced, the more people will go, well, what's the sense in a 10 p.m. curfew? Like, you just chuck everyone out on the streets at the same time. It doesn't actually reduce infection. And the less sense things make, the less people stick to it, and the less people feel that we are all in it together.
Well, one area that there does seem to be some agreement is between the opposition and the government over keeping schools and universities open. Stephen, last time, Labour was criticised for not coming out to keep schools open or reopen them sooner. Was he stung by that criticism, Keir Starmer? Is that why he's backing it this time?
No, I think, to be honest, actually, if you spoke to a member of the Shadow Cabinet during that time, partly because quite a lot of them have quite small children, they would almost grab you by the lapels and go, you've got to get my kids out. I'm really worried about my kids and you've got to get them back to school. So I think it is primarily that most parents, and this includes basically everyone in the Shadow Cabinet, deeply worried about the impact on their children. We've now seen that. They've both seen that in their own households, but we can see that in the information about children now returning to school. And I think people are very aware that if we think of this in terms of a risk budget, where we risk certain things in order to increase our infection and we shut down other things, it's very clear that keeping schools open is basically the most important thing not to have to shut.
Right, not everyone agrees, Stella. I don't know what your view is, but I'm showing our guests who can see it and viewers this tweet by Diane Abbott, a former member of the Shadow Cabinet, saying that Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, is right when he says schools need to close or Greater Manchester will face Tier 3 restrictions for Christmas. Where are you?
Well, so what I think is so frustrating is that we had a tier system for schools and that's not been used. Look, this is difficult. I can understand lots of parents have contacted me over the weekend in Walthamstow saying surely the schools should close. But we're also looking at the data that shows the impact on inequality. And I represent a community that has the 9th highest level of child poverty in the country. I've been very struck over the last 7 months about the inequality impact of having schools closed and what that means for the futures of these kids. Stephen is right. There's a trade-off. One of the reasons why you close some of the other venues is to be able to keep schools and universities open. And I think in this conversation, and it needs to be a conversation with the schools and with the parents, we have to look at the impact on inequality if we close schools. And there's some evidence from the Education Endowment Foundation that shows it could be as much as a 75% impact on the attainment gap. Now, that is an incredibly serious thing that all of us have to factor into our conversations about this, not just in London, but across the country.
Right. Well, let's look at what's happening elsewhere with the devolved nations, because they are going different ways. We know in Wales that they already are in the middle of a 2-week fire break. The First Minister, Mark Drayford, had this to say today.
As from the 9th of November, schools will reopen in full. Working from home will become even more important. And all business premises which have been shut since the 23rd of October will be able to reopen again on Monday of next week.
Danny, does this pose problems? We're going into a month-long national lockdown. Wales is going to be coming out of their fire break next week. What problems does it pose?
Well, I think we've demonstrated that when people are unclear about what's supposed to be happening where they are, then the system doesn't work as well because it relies on compliance people don't give. And so it may have an undermining effect on compliance in the rest of the United Kingdom, but we'll just have to see. Look, the Welsh government, like the Scottish government, is like Boris Johnson. They've got very difficult trade-offs and decisions to make. And so I can't, on the one hand, say we've got to be understanding of the difficulties and the chaos that's created, and then on the other hand, attack the anomaly of Wales. My view is we have to be more understanding of anomalies, of last-minute changes of policy, of changes of direction. That is just the way these things are, and we can't leap on them. And 1 minute say we should keep the pubs open but close the schools, and the next minute that we should close the schools and keep the pubs open. Then we should close both. Then we're against a national lockdown. It's always possible to criticise everything. So my view is I'm relaxed about them doing what they think is the right thing for Wales, and we'll see.
All right, we're going to move on because this programme has been told that 9 Windrush victims have died before receiving compensation. Here's Jack Fenwick.
Arrivals at Tilbury. The Empire Windrush brings to Britain 500 Jamaicans. Many are ex-servicemen who know England. They served this country well. In Jamaica, they couldn't find work. Discouraged but full of hope, they sailed for Britain. Citizens of the British Empire coming to the mother country with good intent.
In spring 2018, the British government was rocked by the Windrush scandal.
If you lay down with dogs, you get fleas!
Thousands of people born in the Commonwealth who'd lived and worked in the UK for decades had no paperwork to prove their legal right to remain. More than 80 people were deported. Countless others lost their jobs.
Good morning, Home Secretary.
The Home Secretary resigned, and the government promised to right the wrongs for the victims.
A new compensation scheme will be put in place for those whose lives have been disrupted. We will do right by the Windrush generation.
Yeah. My name is Glenda Caesar. I came to England when I was 6 months old as a baby, and I basically grew up in Hackney. Went to school until I became an adult and a mother at a very young age. I was told to be a civil servant, work for the government, which I did. I ended up working for the NHS with over 20 odd years service with them. And throughout when time came for retirement, my children were grown up, I took on a part-time position. 4 hours a day, I was very happy until I got told that I couldn't work there anymore because I didn't have a British passport. I didn't have the right to work. I was told I didn't have the right to live here or work here, and I'm still fighting the cause now for compensation.
Using freedom of information laws, I've been asking the Home Office some questions about the compensation scheme. In particular, something called an impact on life assessment. That goes from level 1, essentially a minor inconvenience on someone's life, all the way up to level 6, a likely irreversible impact. These documents show that as of the end of August, there'd been more than 1,500 Windrush claims. 250 of those were awarded one of these payments, but fewer than 5 people had been offered that top level. Hi, Glenda. Lovely to meet you. So I've come to find out what Glenda has made of the compensation process.
It's stressful, it's long, it's tiring. The whole process of doing the compensation form is something you cannot do by yourself. You definitely need legal help. You call them up and you're not getting directly through to the person who's supposed to be allocated to your case. And that alone, that just raises your stress level because you're getting more angry because you're not getting a result. I think it was a couple of months later I got a reply back and I was shocked because I had been out of employment for 10 years, wasn't able to get benefits, contemplated suicide, and then to get a letter saying we're offering you £13,000 for loss of employment, we're offering you £7,000 for impact on life, and we're offering you £1,500 for detain. It's like, there's something wrong somewhere. And I was like, no, I have to go public with this. This isn't fair.
This summer, one of the most prominent Windrush victims, Paulette Wilson, died aged 64. She never did receive her compensation. But Paulette Wilson's case isn't unique. The Home Office has confirmed to me that as of the end of August, they're now aware of 9 cases where a Windrush claimant has died without receiving compensation.
It's made people sort of like realise, my God, she was a high-profile case, and to know that they still hadn't sorted out her compensation. So I said, well, what are they doing? They're playing about now. Now we know that they're definitely playing about. This is why I won't let it rest, because I don't want to hear another person's died through stress. I don't want to hear that at all.
The Home Office says the scheme has paid out or offered more than £2.8 million. They say they work with families to ensure compensation is still paid out when claimants pass away, and that the process is designed to offer as much compensation as possible to each person.
Some people give up, and I think that is their strategy. They're using it as strategy, hoping that we will give up. But you've come across a generation who are not ready to give up.
From the Windrush generation there. Stephen, has the government done right by that generation?
I mean, no. I mean, visibly, right, 9 people have died without their compensation. I think this is actually a much broader and sadly typical government problem, which actually you see this across big organisations all the time, which is to make it very hard for people to complain, to drown people in procedural bureaucracy, and it means that they cannot get the justice and redress that they deserve. This is a very tragic example, but it is sadly, I think, broadly typical, and we could find examples of behaviour like this across pretty much every government department and every large organisation in public life.
Timandra?
Yeah, I think you're probably right. And one of the terrible things is the absolute inhumanity of the way the problem came to light and was then dealt with. So people who absolutely visibly have lived here for decades and have a life here, but
didn't have the paperwork.
And there should be absolutely no question of, oh, OK, well, that was that historical anomaly decades and decades ago. We will just sort you out now, because it's self-evident on a human level that you have the right to be here and the right for complete citizenship. And to try and put any bureaucratic barriers in the way is just unforgivable.
Stella, on the compensation, what do you think the government should do, or do you think they're doing a good job, albeit very slowly?
At the risk of repeating Danny's idea that all I do is score political points, I have to say we've had some of these cases in my constituency, and it is maddening and heartbreaking, because these are... it's not just the impact on the individual. I mean, how you put a price on what impact it had for somebody to lose their job, potentially be deported, their family not be able to benefit from their income is extraordinary. One thing I would say, and one thing I'm very, very concerned about, is that this is not unique as a process. And actually, I agree with Stephen. I think governments of all colours have over the years failed to be effective in putting right when things have come to light that are wrong. But one of the things that's really troubling me is I see the same problems that came up with the Windrush generation, how the Home Office and the UKBA dealt with them, coming up with some of the EU citizens' cases. And I want to put that on the record now and sound the alarm now, especially when you've got Priti Patel talking about deporting homeless people. In particular, I've spent quite a bit of time in the last couple of months in my local community trying to help some of those people who are EU nationals but don't have their papers and may have been homelessness, who are facing similar experiences about trying to get hold of paperwork, trying to prove themselves and not getting support from the Home Office. And I just worry that we are repeating the same patterns again because, frankly, that department doesn't put value on the lives of people who maybe weren't born here in this country.
Danny?
Well, first of all, let me reassure Stella, I think you do much more than just make political points or score political points. That isn't what I meant at all. But on this, one of the things that I noticed a lot when working for the Conservative Party when it was in office, quite a while ago now, but I don't think it's changed that much, is that you're often told, you want to do something, but you can't do it because the rules won't allow you. Sometimes there are legal reasons why you can't do it. And a lot of running a government, I think, is being able to spot when you're being told those things and when you can't accept that constraint and you have to go beyond it. And I think what's happening here, it sounds to me, is that nobody's actually doing that. This was a disaster in every respect, a disaster of governmental administration and of policy. And as a result, government has to do something more than its normal processes to put it right. So I think that was a very worthwhile report and points to something, and Stephen's right, that happens in big organisations, but government's particularly susceptible to, which is following its sort of rules in a situation when that is no longer really a tenable approach.
I mean, it may be an unfair comparison to make, but actually, during this pandemic, we've seen Rishi Sunak, for example, be able to move quite quickly when it comes to,
Correct.
For instance, giving some sort of compensation or money during things like the furlough scheme. Stephen?
I think it's a very good comparison.
Sorry, Danny, that's my fault. I'll go on, finish your answer and then I'll come to Stephen. I was looking at Stephen, but how would you know?
That was a very good comparison to make. There you go. Now you can look at Steve.
OK, Stephen.
Yeah, well, I think this is exactly it. And one of the reasons why the furlough happened comparatively quickly is the government threw out its traditional fear of fraud. And actually only 1 in 10 of those claims, so a teeny tiny amount of money in comparison to the huge sums paid out by the furlough, were given out in fraudulent cases. And one of the reasons why governments of all stripes tend to do this, like you must fill out Form 555A, is this deep-seated fear of fraud. And I think actually when an injustice of the kind Timandra very eloquently described, like this one, has taken place, that is a time to do what Rishi Sunak did with the furlough and go, actually, we are not going to stress the small stuff over fraud in this specific case, because we kind of know that when we don't enforce it, it would only about 1 in 10 and a comparatively tiny amount of money.
Let's talk about the American presidential election. We have Galen Druke from the 538 podcast, a regular on our programme. There he is in New York, I think. Last day of campaigning, frantic efforts by both Trump and Biden. I just want to pick up, Galen, on the article, the lead article, in fact, on your website, which is entitled, "I'm here to remind you Trump can still win. We can see it here," by Nate Silver. What are the chances, Galen?
According to our forecast, President Trump has about a 1 in 10 chance of winning a second term. Now, to put that probability in perspective, in downtown Los Angeles, it rains about 36 days out of the year. So basically, there's a 10% chance that on any day it might rain in downtown LA. Of course, it does still rain in LA, but it doesn't happen all that often. So it's important to put this all in perspective, understanding that, yes, Joe Biden has a 90% chance of winning election, but that is not a 100% chance.
Right. So how likely are we to get a clear result overnight, Tuesday, Wednesday?
It really depends on margins here. If it looks like Biden is running away with this election, we could know relatively early because Florida is quick at counting its ballots. They're quick at counting their mail ballots, and also they can count day of ballots relatively quickly as well. If it's close in Florida, then we still may not have a good idea. Or if Trump wins Florida, Biden could still win in the Midwest and win the presidency, but we wouldn't know. And so in large part, it comes down to the margins in some of those southern states like Florida or Georgia, maybe even Arizona, Texas, on election night. But even if it seems clear like one of the candidates is winning, it may be the case that no one gets to 270 electors that night because the Midwest could take a while to count its vote.
OK, what are the latest polls saying?
Well, nationally, Joe Biden is up by about 8.5 points. But as we all know from 2016, the national popular vote is irrelevant when it comes to winning American elections. Right now, the likeliest tipping point state, meaning the state that is likeliest to give the winning candidate their 270th electoral college vote, is Pennsylvania. So maybe think of that as more like the margin. And in Pennsylvania, Biden is up 5 points. Now, 5 points is decent, but if there is polling error, as we saw in 2016, there's always a chance that he could not win Pennsylvania. Pollsters have made some adjustments since then, making sure that they reach more non-college educated white voters or that they give them more weight in their polling sample. But, it's hard to know where the error might be in polls from one year to the next. And of course, the polling error could go in the opposite direction and Biden could outperform his poll numbers as well.
Galen, thank you for joining us. We'll talk to you soon. Or actually, can you stay just for the last few minutes of the programme? Not long to wait. Now you're up. Stella, what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's always important to remember with American elections is the way the electoral college system works is you can be ahead in the national polls. I mean, I think Hillary had an extra 4 million votes over Trump. But because they have a system where you have to win a state, and once you win a state, you get all of those votes, actually it could be incredibly close. I don't want to be as depressed as I'm sure many people might be, because I've seen the polling that shows there's nowhere in the UK that would vote for Trump.
Yep.
I think because it's a different electoral system, it's worth bearing in mind this is going to be very, very close. I mean, he won by a landslide last time. He only has to win it by a small amount, and then he gets a massive lump of votes for the Electoral College. And that seems a possibility as well this time. So Danny? I am desperate, but wary.
Danny?
I think it could be better rather than worse. That's what the figures show. But I'm not going to make up my own modelling. I think the 538 model is very good. I think it's very good modelling. I thought it was very good last time. It guided me to be much more, think Trump had a much better chance than most people here thought. So it was very helpful to me. And this time I think it's overwhelmingly likely Biden will win, which means there's a substantial chance he'll win by a lot. It's not certain, nothing's certain, but I think there's a pretty good chance.
Timandra?
I just think it's interesting that the polling does not work as well as it used to. And we get that over here as well, that it's very difficult to predict political votes because politics has changed. It's much more fragmented. We don't sit comfortably left and right anymore. And I think that should remind us that whatever happens with Trump himself, the phenomenon that led America to elect somebody who's so overtly anti-politics has not gone away. And we can't just go, oh, well, Trump's in or Trump's out. The question we should be asking is what has happened to politics in America? And, slightly differently here, I think, that means people will vote against politics.
Stephen?
I can't really imagine being in a country where it only rains 10% of the time. And I don't really understand a country like that enough to make a prediction, so I won't.
All right, well, good for you. Returning to the rain. Galen, just briefly, Trump has said he's going in with his lawyers once the election is over. Just very briefly, what does that mean?
I think he wants the election to be close enough that potentially by litigating in order to get certain ballots not counted or thrown out, that the result of the election could be dragged on for a while and end up in the courts. Of course, our forecast model gives the chance that we're in recount territory somewhere in the range of 4%. So it's not the likeliest outcome that we'll have a close enough election for it to be litigated and then won in the courts. But of course, it sounds like that's what Trump wants.
Right. Galen, thank you very much for joining us. Just briefly, which state will you be watching out for most?
Of course, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely. But on election night, Florida.
OK, Florida. Listening to that in terms of any legal wrangling, how worried are you about that?
I mean, I think we have to be quite worried. Trump is someone who said he was dubious about accepting the result of an election he might have lost in 2016 when he wasn't the incumbent. He now has all of the powers of incumbency. And ultimately, democracies live or die based on losers accepting the result. And it's not clear that Donald Trump is someone who would accept the result of an election he lost.
All right, it's going to be a very busy few days. I'm pretty sure we'll all be staying up for most of the night to find out what happens. I'll be back tomorrow.